What's going on, everybody? Cleepus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you my first impressions of the TCL 30XL. Now before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing and availability. But with that being said, let's get into it. So before we actually get to the phone itself, let's take a look at what comes in the box. So first off, and this is really easy to miss, we got a SIM card removal tool, we got a USB wall charger, a USB-C cable, a quick start guide, and finally a little starter case. Now this isn't really the best case in the world, but it definitely does get the job done, and nowadays most phones don't even come with a case, so this is definitely nice to have. Now moving on to the phone itself, with the TCL 30XL, we're getting a 6.82-inch LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 270, an aspect ratio of 20.5:9, and a 90% screen to body ratio. So overall, despite only being a really basic 720p display, I do think it looks really good, the colors look real nice, and the viewing angles, despite just being a regular LCD display, are really not that bad. So if you're out in the sun, for example, this phone is actually going to be a bit easier to see than most phones in this price range. Another cool thing about this phone you're going to notice right away is that it's really large. With a 6.82-inch display, it's definitely going to be real good for content consumption. So if you're doing stuff like watching videos, for example, the TCL 30XL is going to be a good choice for that. In addition to this, with a 20.5:9 aspect ratio, we're getting a really tall and narrow form factor. So if you're doing something like watching a video in landscape mode, for example, you're going to get a more immersive experience. And if you're doing something vertical like reading an article or scrolling through social media, you'll be able to fit more content on the screen without having to scroll as much. So in general, while the display isn't perfect, it's really just a regular 720p LCD display. For a really entry-level phone, I do think this display is one of the better ones in this price range. Now for storage with the TCL 30XL, we're getting 64GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion. So definitely a pretty decent amount of storage here. Sure, if you're more of a power user, if you have a bunch of apps and stuff like that, 128 might be a more ideal amount for you. But for a more entry-level phone, considering that there are actually quite a few phones in this price range that only have 32GB, 64 definitely isn't bad. And again, remember, there is microSD card expansion here, and this is going to be great if you want to offload stuff like photos and videos. Now for security features, the TCL 30XL does have face unlock, as well as a fingerprint scanner right here on the back. So definitely nice to have two options to unlock it besides a pin, but let's go ahead and give the fingerprint scanner a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see, the fingerprint scanner is real fast and responsive, no issues at all. And again, remember, this phone does have face unlock as well, so if you want to use that instead, you always can. Now taking a look at the camera setup here, for the front-facing camera, we got a water drop notch, and while I'm not really a huge fan of water drop notches, this one is really thin, and along with the super thin bezels this phone has, it really doesn't look bad at all. And as far as the quality goes, this camera is 13 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a quad camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 5 megapixel ultra-wide camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So in general, as far as features go, for being more of an entry-level phone, the TCL 30XL actually does have a pretty good camera setup. Now for video, it has a max quality of 1080p in both the rear and front cameras, but again, remember, this is more of a lower end phone. And in 2022, the vast majority of phones in this price range are not going to be able to record in 4K anyway. But overall, again, this is really just my first impressions of this phone, so I haven't actually used the camera yet. But just judging by the specs alone, and based on the camera quality of other TCL phones I've used, I definitely am expecting to get at least decently nice photo quality here. Now as far as RAM and processor go, with the TCL 30XL, we're getting 6GB of RAM with the MediaTek Helio A25 processor. Now this isn't necessarily an exceptionally fast processor, so definitely don't expect to get anything near flagship or even mid-range performance for that matter, because again, this is really just an entry-level phone with an entry-level processor. But one really nice thing here is that we're actually getting 6GB of RAM, and I've seen phones that are quite a bit more expensive than this that only have 4, so that is a nice thing to see. Now I did run a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on this phone, and it came back with a single core score of 156 and a multi-core score of 885. Now in general, if you're not too familiar with this kind of test, this might not mean a whole lot to you, so what I recommend doing is downloading Geekbench 5 and running this test on your current phone and comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of whether or not this phone is going to be an upgrade for you. But in general, in my limited time using this phone, things have run pretty smoothly, and I haven't had any performance issues. But that being said, I definitely say this phone is mainly meant for more basic activities, like sending text messages, making calls, really just using the phone as a phone, and then some light web browsing and social media and stuff like that. But if you're on your phone all the time, or maybe you're doing higher performance activities like mobile gaming, for example, you're probably going to want a faster device than this. Now as far as the battery goes, the TCL 30 XL is getting a 5000 mAh battery that supports 18-watt fast charging. So especially for this price range, this is a really good battery. Even other TCL phones, like the TCL Stylus 5G for example, that's a little bit higher end than this, only has a 4000 mAh battery, whereas again with the TCL 30 XL we are getting a 5000 mAh battery. So if you want a phone with really good battery life and longevity, maybe you have a more mobile lifestyle and you can't always plug in your phone all day, then this phone is going to be a great choice for you. And of course, in addition to this, the 18-watt fast charging doesn't hurt either, and in my experience with a good fast charger, the charging speeds are definitely going to save you some time. Now one thing about this phone I'm not a huge fan of is it doesn't have NFC, so if you like to make contactless mobile payments using tap and pay, unfortunately you're not going to be able to do that with this phone. But then again, there are plenty of people out there of course who don't use NFC, so this is probably not going to be a deal breaker for most people. But now that we've gone over some of the specs and features, let's take a closer look at the phone itself. So on the left side here, we got the slot for the SIM card and the micro SD card. On the bottom, we got the microphone, speaker, and a USB-C port. On the right side, we got our power key, volume down, volume up. On the top, we got a noise canceling microphone and a 3.5mm headphone jack. On the back, we got the camera module, our flash, fingerprint scanner, and TCL branding at the bottom. In general, this phone has a really typical TCL design, which I personally am a big fan of. On one hand, sure, it doesn't look exceptionally unique or interesting, but on the other hand, the quality feels really good, the buttons are sturdy, it has a decent amount of weight to it, which is definitely not something you see every day in a phone in this price range. And despite being on the larger side, it is really comfortable to hold. So with this phone, you're really getting the benefits of having a huge display, but the typical drawbacks of a larger phone being a little bit more bulky are really not a problem with this phone. But in conclusion, my first impressions of the TCL 30 XL. In general, I didn't really see anything super unique about this phone, really just your typical entry-level phone that's not too low-end, but also still not quite mid-range. I really do like that it has a huge display, and the quality is really good for just being a basic 720p LCD, which overall isn't really that surprising, since after all, TCL did originally start out making TVs, and they put that same technology into their displays, so I have noticed that in general, the displays on TCL phones, compared to other phones with similar specs, typically tend to be a little bit better. But yeah, if you're consuming a lot of content like streaming videos, playing games, using social media and stuff like that, you definitely will get a good experience with the TCL 30 XL. And relative to other phones in this price range, I really think the display is a big strong point for this phone. The other thing I really like about it is the camera setup. This phone has pretty much all the camera features you could ask for, including an ultra-wide camera and a macro camera. And while I haven't seen the photo quality yet for a phone in this price range, although having all these features is definitely not unheard of, a full camera setup like this is still not nearly as common in this price range as it is with phones that are double the price. And of course, another great thing about this phone is the battery. Having a 5000 mAh battery, whether you're looking for an entry-level phone or a really high-end phone, is something you're just never going to go wrong with. So if battery life is important to you, the TCL 30 XL is going to be a great choice. But this concludes my first look of the TCL 30 XL. Again, if you want to learn more about it, I will be linking to several other videos about the phone in the description as I make them, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and my favorite accessories for it. So definitely check that out if you're interested. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.